When it comes to plague outbreaks in Europe, your mind probably doesn't immediately jump to a so-called dancing plague. Yet that's precisely what seemed to grip Strasbourg, France in the summer of 1518. Townspeople started dancing, seemingly against their will, and couldn't stop for almost a month. Hundreds apparently died of exhaustion, with contemporary commentators blaming the wrath of St Vitus. More recently, people have suspected ergot poisoning, religious fervour, or mass psychogenic illness. So what exactly happened and how does it relate to folklore? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing our tour of the folklore of European cities, except I will point out that this is the 7th one that we've done, and it is going to be slightly different from the preceding 6. So in the earlier instalments, they've included a variety of ghost stories and legends and so on. This one is going to focus solely on a single episode from Strasbourg's history, and that is the Dancing Plague of 1518, because it has become a legend in its own right. Because when I was researching the episode, it became quite apparent that that was going to be the biggest thing to focus on, and I will say in advance it does sound a lot like a history episode, but we'll get into why it's related to folklore at the end. So I hope that you enjoy it anyway. As I say, it is ever so slightly different from the previous ones, but it is such a really noteworthy example that I thought it was worth putting in there anyway. Now, because there is some mention of ergot in this episode, I thought, I'll see if rye was actually in the Victorian language of flowers. So yes, this episode is brought to you by ryegrass, which meant changeable disposition according to Mrs. Burke's Language of Flowers dictionary. Who on earth is giving people ryegrass as a gift? You have to wonder. But yeah, so I have remembered to do that, and I've even made it relevant to the story this time, which makes a change. But anyway, on to the Dancing Plague of Strasbourg. So in July 1518, Frau Troffea walked into a square and started dancing uncontrollably. People gathered to watch, surprised that she seemed unable to stop. Frau Troffea danced for almost a week, pausing only when exhaustion forced her to, until the authorities took her away. This sounds like a really strange thing to witness, obviously, and there are various things in the records about the fact that she would essentially drop from exhaustion, and then once she'd recovered sufficiently, she would get back up and just start dancing again. But by the time the authorities had finally taken her away, dozens more of Strasbourg citizens had joined Frau Troffea's plight. Now, in some sources there were 34 at the outset, and others say that the crowd swelled to 400 by the end of July. Now, these people danced themselves to the point of exhaustion in the square. Obviously mystified by this unprovoked chaos, the city burghers consulted doctors for a proposed treatment plan. Now, given this was the 16th century, the doctors decided that the dancers must have overheated blood, and normally you would prescribe bleeding people for something like that. But the doctors decided they were going to propose something radical and even less scientific, and they decided that the victims needed even more dancing. Because as their logic ran, those affected could then dance the problem out of their system. So the authorities were like, yep, fine, cool, we'll do that. Possibly in slightly more era-appropriate language, but they cleared a grain market, hired musicians, built a stage, and then moved the unwilling dancers into the space. Now, bear in mind that this all occurred during the hottest months of the year and in full sun. So you won't be surprised to hear that quite a lot of people fell unconscious and died from exhaustion. Now, in some chronicles, 15 people a day were dying in this fashion. And bear in mind, this went on for about a month, so that gives you an idea of what the rough death toll of this would be. Now, eventually, the councillors decided that the doctor's diagnosis must be wrong because nothing seemed to be ending, and if anything, it was actually getting worse. So they decided, okay, the cause must be religious instead. So they then banned dancing in public and actually sent the most badly affected dancers to a shrine for St Vitus about 3 miles away. The clergy there put the dancers' feet into red shoes and then anointed their feet with holy oil and holy water. In some versions of the legend, they walked the people around a statue of the saint until they stopped dancing and then largely recovered. In others, they laid the dancers beneath a wooden carving of St Vitus, but again they recovered. So as the cure began to work, the council then sent more dancers to the shrine from Strasbourg. So you might wonder why St Vitus, so I thought it was worth including a little bit on who he was. And he was apparently the son of a senator in Sicily who converted to Christianity at either 12 or 13. The sources don't agree. But at one point his father apparently saw angels in front of Vitus and then went blind, so Vitus prayed for him and his father regained his sight. Valerian, Sicily's administrator, got wind of Vitus's miracles and decided to test his faith. Now Valerian failed in this goal, but Vitus still fled to Rome with his tutor and servant. He apparently managed to cast an evil spirit out of Emperor Diocletian's son, apparently by laying his hands on the son's head, but Vitus then refused to make any sacrifices to the gods when the son recovered, so the emperor decided that he must have cured his son through sorcery, and that was why he wouldn't make any sacrifices to the gods. The emperor then subjected Vitus to a range of tortures. At one point he was supposedly thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil. And some versions of the legend say that Vitus escaped during a storm, returned to Lucania, apparently guided by an angel, and then died there following his ordeal. Other ones seem to think that he actually died in the cauldron of boiling oil, so I'm not really sure if there is indeed such a thing as a correct one or not. But either way, St Vitus became the patron saint of dancers, actors, and those suffering from epilepsy or Sydenham's chorea, otherwise known as St Vitus's dance. And Dr. A.C. Eftichiadis actually describes St Vitus as being the patron saint of neurological disorders. Now, I think that's probably because of the association of Vitus with the head through curing his father's blindness and laying his hands on the emperor's son's head. So we can kind of see where that would come from. Other than him being the patron saint of these things, people might also invoke his protection during storms, and his feast day is June the 15th. But ultimately, no one really knows what caused the outbreak, and it's highly unlikely that it was divine intervention on behalf of a wrathful saint. But the main thing that seems to stick out for most commentators is the fact that no one seemed to be dancing of their own volition. So people weren't exactly watching what was going on and going, oh, this looks like great fun, and then joining in. So there had to be some kind of cause beyond that. And obviously people have theories, because people always do. And that old favourite ergotism took the blame for a while. Now, ergot grows on damp rye, hence the reason I mentioned it earlier, and is the source of ergotamine, which provides similar psychoactive effects to LSD. Now, ergot poisoning most often leads to confusion, trembling limbs and vertigo, among other things, and it can also sometimes cause a burning sensation in the limbs and gangrene, which is known as St Anthony's fire. So while ergot poisoning does induce twitching and hallucinations, it's highly unlikely that sufferers would have danced for days on end, and historian John Waller has kind of proved that that wouldn't work, because the symptoms of ergot poisoning and the symptoms of this dancing plague just basically aren't the same. Nowadays there are treatments for ergot poisoning even if there's no specific antidote, but it's also unlikely that everyone afflicted would have eaten the same foodstuffs, and if they had, you would think that the dancing plague would have all kind of broken out at the same time rather than in the staggered fashion that it did. Religious fervour even came under suspicion at one point, but too many observers noted the dancers' inability to actually stop dancing. So some witnesses described them as not seeming to be fully conscious, which makes religious fervour less likely. But it does leave us with one other possibility, and that's what used to be called mass hysteria but is now called mass psychogenic illness. So where on earth would that come from? Well, there had been dancing outbreaks sporadically in the previous centuries, and they nearly always happened in settlements near the River Rhine. So it's fairly understandable because news would travel along the river and ideas would also travel, and in this case it was an idea that St Vitus might make sinners dance as a punishment. It also probably didn't help that 2 decades before the outbreak, the Strasbourg cleric Sebastian Brandt claimed dance and sin were essentially the same thing and blamed Satan for dancing. So you have to wonder, did his words take root in the cultural unconsciousness of Strasbourg, so people might not have been consciously worrying about such a thing, but it would be there in the back of their mind nonetheless. Now, Paracelsus didn't think so, and he's most famous for his early work in chemistry and medicine, but Paracelsus was also the same thinker that named the creatures that inhabit the elements, which is the salamanders, undines, gnomes and sylphs. But he also thought that the dancing plague had an earthly origin and little to do with St Vitus or divine punishments. But there's 2 kind of strands to his argument, and in one he thought that a person could develop something like laughing veins, and this sensation would then force them to move until the blood calmed. So he actually recommends things like, cooling them down by throwing them into cold water and things like that. But it is also worth noting that he did consider that women or minstrels were more susceptible to dancing plague, and that such a plague was the consequence of a sinful life rather than a divine punishment for it. So, like, this general misogyny in what he's saying essentially speaks to the idea that because women and minstrels are more licentious and more wanton and so on, that could then express itself as this dancing. And he did actually coin the term choreomania for these dancing outbreaks. And what's really interesting, though, is while a lot of what he said is really unlikely, the fact that he thought that the imagination was more of a problem than divine intervention marks a bit of a break with older ways of thinking, but it also takes us closer to mass psychogenic illness. And that can be further divided into two types. So you've got mass anxiety hysteria and mass motor hysteria. So mass anxiety hysteria sees a mass expression of anxiety followed a perceived but false threat. So it's important to note that the threat is not actually real. It's just something that people are worried about. So in the West, people might faint, hyperventilate or feel nauseous after fearing exposure to poison or some kind of toxic chemicals and so on. And if the fear isn't treated as a credible one, it actually normally just goes off by itself in a few days. Obviously at the point at which people realise, actually, hang on, I'm still fine. It's obviously not what I think it is. And there have been incidents of that sort of recorded in schools and things. Whereas mass motor hysteria sees some kind of psychological tension then manifest through either dissociation or psychomotor activities, which would include things like dancing mania or the possession crises that you sometimes get as well. Now, some people have actually pointed to the behaviour of the girls during the Salem witch trials as potentially being an occurrence of mass psychogenic illness, which makes a much better candidate than ergot poisoning, which was blamed for a while. But you do see this almost kind of one person starts off, so it kind of starts a chain reaction and other people to then behave in the same way. And part of the problem comes from this notion of belief, because it can often affect our behaviour and not always in a good way. So people will adhere to culturally prescribed ideas about how people should behave. And John Waller gives the example of European convents in which nuns might convulse, foam at the mouth and meow like cats if they thought that they'd been possessed. Now that might all sound a little bit strange to us, but it would make perfect sense to people living in a community that was preoccupied by sin. So if people thought that possessed people would behave a certain way, then if they thought they'd become possessed, then they would behave in the same way as well. And Waller suggests that this can explain Strasbourg's dancing plague in 1518. The chronicles agree that a lot of people jumped to the conclusion that St Vitus had caused the plague. So if a devout person believed they'd somehow offended St Vitus, then they might enter a trance state and dance for days because that was the curse that they believed he'd rained on them. And the problem was, it spread so quickly because the councillors essentially put the dancers on show in public, which then forced other people to contemplate their own sins, and then susceptible people would then follow suit and start dancing. So one of the reasons why the outbreak was basically as bad as it was, because the councillors had taken that decision to move the dancers into a public square where more people could see them. Now, I don't think they did it specifically so people could see them. I think they were just looking for a large enough space to accommodate everyone, but because it was in public, more people saw it, and therefore more people who were susceptible to these ideas would obviously then go along with it. Now, that's not to victim blame either, it's just that is the environment in which people were raised at the time, so it is what it is, really. But also the idea that if you believed it was caused by St Vitus, if you were then made to pay penance to St Vitus, you might reach a point where you felt you'd been forgiven, and then you would stop dancing. And then when other people stopped dancing, other dancers would do likewise as well. So you can kind of almost use the infectious nature of it in reverse as well. Now, the belief system at the time did mean that such curses were believed to be caused by the divine, and therefore only the divine or those with divine authority could end them. So that meant that a priest might pray to a saint for intervention, or indeed people might obviously hope to go to the shrine and get intervention themselves by the saint. It is, however, noteworthy that the City Council's first form of treatment was the one prescribed by doctors, not the clergy. And ironically, if they'd actually gone with the clergy's option in the first place, it might have actually all blown over a lot more quickly and with a lot fewer people being involved. But this is just what happens in the development of medicine. Now, it is worth looking at the wider context, because A, wider context is always important in no matter what you're looking at. And B, I think in this case it really helps to explain why there was this congruence of factors really that helped this to happen when it did. Now, chronicles describe 1517 in particular as a really bad year, but Waller does note that the whole decade prior to the dancing plague had been terrible. So you've got failed harvests, you've got soaring food prices, you've got social conflict, there's various types of unrest and so on, syphilis arrives, and you've also got the reappearance of plague and leprosy. So this all creates a really miserable space in which people feared for the future. And unfortunately, here we are in 2024, and I think we can probably empathise with them more than we might want to. But by mid-1518, the desperate were flooding shelters, orphanages and hospitals. So if you put all of these things together, you create this really stressful sort of situation with all this chronic tension that just isn't being resolved. And over the course of 10 years, that's a lot of stress to put people under. So in a lot of ways, was it any wonder that people feared divine punishment by St Vitus? And it all basically left people vulnerable to mass psychogenic illness. So it's a situation where the social context, the political context, everything adds up to create this perfect storm that leads to the dancing plague. And in a political sense as well, it's worth bearing this in mind, the shifting currents in Strasbourg might have also played a role as well. So the scholar Erasmus visited in 1514 and influenced a move towards a more humanist clergy. And while the church still had a large number of churches, monasteries and convents, the guilds were growing in power and influence. So essentially power was shifting from nobles to the merchants and artisans. And this essentially means Strasbourg is caught between the medieval and the modern at this particular point. And yes, I'm going to use the L word. It's a liminal space. It's not really fully divested from the old way of doing things. The new way of doing things hasn't really fully taken root yet. So again, you've got this clash between medical ideas and divine ideas all coming together at this particular point in time. So what does all of this have to do with folklore, you might be wondering? Why have I included this? Well, partly because I thought it was actually really interesting and I wanted to include Strasbourg anyway, because Strasbourg is beautiful, well worth a visit if you get the chance. But history and folklore often go hand in hand. And in this particular case, the legend isn't quite as straightforward as it appears. And it seems that different contemporary sources from the time actually record mass dancing for several weeks. And they include city council notes, chronicles, bits from church sermons, and even doctor's notes. And that the dancing plague happened is not actually in dispute. It's a factual thing. It happened. And Frau Trofea is often named as the instigator in like 4 of the 6 chronicles that talk about it. So even there's some consistency. But beyond that, the details start to vary, including the start dates or even how the authorities contained the phenomenon. So you do almost find different things written about how they actually treated the people at St Vitus' shrine. Did they take all of the dancers? Did they just take some of them? These kind of details all vary in the telling, which to me implies that a lot of it was being written by people who weren't necessarily physically there, whereas at the very beginning of it, perhaps there were more eyewitnesses. And a lot of what we think of as fact actually comes from later writers such as Paracelsus. Now, he was still writing within 10 years of this, but he wasn't directly there at the time. And also you get one of the variations of the story in one article and a different variation in another. So it's quite difficult to piece together what's actually true. So it is a legend with a basis in fact, but after a certain point, we're not really sure which part is legend and which part is fact. So, for example, the details about the way in which those sent to St Vitus' shrine were handled comes from Sebastian Brandt's Annals, which was a manuscript from the city archives, which is now lost. So while the records do provide this degree of factual basis for the events, we also don't know how people who lived in Strasbourg actually felt about what was happening because nobody's preserved their voices. So ordinary people kind of get forgotten about. So this particular historical episode, while factual, has still also taken on the basis of legend. And I think part of this is due to how long ago it actually happened, but also partly due to the different elements involved. So you've got things like a vengeful saint, you've got the clash between early modern medicine and the church, you've got a fatal outbreak following a period of hardship, and you've got all these other different bits and pieces going on that I think a lot of it then kind of converges to create this legend about an actual historical event. You might also think of The Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen, in which a dancer has to persuade an executioner to cut off her feet so she can finally stop dancing. And I mean, to be honest, even punishment lies at the heart of this fairy tale because the dancer dared to want the beautiful shoes and is then punished for that desire, which to be fair is almost the kind of line that Paracelsus would have come out with really. Now, obviously, I've got no way of knowing if Andersen was inspired by the dancing plague of Strasbourg. I don't know if he even knew about it, but the fact that the shoes are red, and obviously that's the colour of the shoes that they have to wear when they go to see St Vitus, and the continual dancing, I think they're really interesting motifs when they're put together. But ultimately, whether we know the full story or not, it's still a really fascinating example of how a relatively short-lived episode in a city's history can still be talked about some 5 centuries later and can then take on legendary status into the bargain. So what I want to know is, what do you think was behind the dancing plague of 1518? As I say, the big one that most of actually all of the commentators that I came across were all kind of going for mass psychogenic illness. So that is the main one. But what do you think may have sparked it? Please do feel free to let me know. Please remember as well, if you leave a comment on Spotify, I can't actually respond because somebody asked us a really good question on Spotify, and I can't remember what it was now, but they asked it a few episodes ago and I'm like, I can't actually reply to that. So if you want an actual response, the best place to comment is either on the blog post, and that's linked in the show notes, or on YouTube, where I can then actually have a conversation with you in the comments. I do want to make a quick announcement about a talk that's coming up. So if you are in Newcastle upon Tyne on the 8th of June at 6 p.m, I'm doing a talk at Newcastle Castle about the summer solstice and Midsummer Day. We are doing it obviously quite a few weeks in advance of the summer solstice, but that's because I'm going to be covering things like a lot of the stuff that was in the summer solstice and midsummer episode with additional folklore. So it's ways to celebrate midsummer, whether or not it's actually an ancient festival in the way that people think that it is, but also a lot of the stuff to do with like plants and magic and divination that can be practiced at midsummer as well. So if all that kind of stuff floats your boat, then feel free to book your ticket. The link is in the show notes below. It is obviously an in-person talk. I know the castle are working at doing them as hybrid ones, but quite honestly, I'll probably end up recording this one and making it available before midsummer anyway, so it's a much more expanded version of the podcast episode that I did, and I think it's 2021, but I could be wrong. So there is going to be a lot more additional stuff in there as well. So if you are around, it would be lovely to see you. But otherwise, I've gone on quite a while now. I haven't decided what I'm doing for the final week. I am leaning towards Milan, but I do need to double check that there's actually enough history there to cover it. But you'll find out next week. Otherwise, I will see you soon, and I hope you have a marvellous week ahead. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.